Good morning. Today I shall present to you the transport of gases. During the lecture, I shall speak about the laws of gas transport. We shall discuss in detail the structure of the respiratory membrane. We shall look at the transport of the major gases, that is your oxygen and carbon dioxide. We shall look at the oxygen dissociation curve and how the curve shifts under different conditions. Especially, we shall talk about the Bohr's effect. Just like the oxygen concentration and its combination can change with the hemoglobin, so can the carbon dioxide. So we shall look at the carbon dioxide dissociation curve as well, and we shall look at the details of the Haldane effect. We shall also look at the different types of gas exchange, that is your perfusion and diffusion limited exchange. And finally, we shall briefly deal with hypoxia and carbon monoxide poisoning. These are the two clinical conditions which you will come across. So we shall go into the details of these. So if you look at the functional anatomy of the lungs, respiration basically consists of two portions. The external respiration, which is the simple taking in of air, and the internal respiration, which occurs at the cellular level, whereby substrates are broken down for the production of energy in the presence of oxygen. So today we shall basically deal mostly with the external respiration. So your air enters through the nose, goes through your epiglottis into your pharynx, to your trachea. From the epiglottis, if it is closed, it comes into your trachea. At the carina, it branches into two and goes to your right lung and the left lung. Now the ventilation which is coming in is rich in oxygen, and this oxygen is exchanged across the capillaries, across the respiratory membrane at the level of the lungs. Now, this exchange is the part which we are going to deal with. So the oxygen is transferred from the alveoli into the capillaries, and the carbon dioxide which has been brought to the lung by the pulmonary capillaries, this will be exchanged at the level of the alveoli, so this can be breathed out. So you will basically look at the pulmonary ventilation. It is the exchange of, it will involve the breathing in or the taking in of the gases, oxygen, breathing out of the carbon dioxide, and how this diffusion occurs across the respiratory membrane. So the functional unit for the respiratory exchange is the respiratory unit, also called the lobule, which consists of the respiratory bronchiole, the alveolar ducts, the atria, the alveoli. Now transport will occur basically by means of your blood, and this blood, which is rich in oxygen, will be carried to the tissues where it can be utilized for internal respiration, that is the breakdown of foodstuffs. Oxidative phosphorylation will occur, and you will have the end products of aerobic metabolism, that is your ATPs and formation of carbon dioxide, which can again be brought back to the lungs to be expired out. So there are certain laws which can apply to the respiratory as well, system as well. So you should look at the Fick's law of diffusion, which gives us a mathematical expression to know the amount of gas which can diffuse out. So if you look at the Fick's law of diffusion, it states that diffusion is directly proportional to the difference in the plasma, in the pressures of the gas on the two sides of the membrane, the area of diffusion, and the solubility complex. So the solubility coefficient, and it inversely dependent on the diffusion distance and the molecular weight of a given substance. So you have the diffusion, which is directly proportional to the delta P into the A, which is the area of cross section, the cross sectional area, S is the solubility of the gas in the given liquid, D is the diffusion distance, and molecular weight of the gas. So the other laws which we will be concerned with are the Henry's law, which states that the concentration of a gas which is dissolved in a given liquid is directly proportional to the partial pressure of the gas, which is the Px, and the solubility coefficient. The next important law is the Graham's law, which gives us the relative rate of diffusion of a given gas is directly proportional to the solubility of the gas in the given liquid, which in this case is our blood, and inversely proportional to the molecular mass. So you have the diffusion rate of carbon dioxide and the diffusion rate of oxygen. If you compare the two, you have the diffusion rate of carbon dioxide, which is directly proportional to the solubility, which is 22. So it not only depends on the solubility alone, because if it only were so, the rate of diffusion, carbon dioxide would be 22 times more diffusible than oxygen. But since it is also inversely proportional to the molecular weight, so the molecular weight of oxygen is 32, when you compare this with the carbon dioxide, the molecular weight of which is 44, you find that the actual law, the rate of diffusion of carbon dioxide is only 19 times and not 22 times. So this is because of the relative rates of diffusion of a given gas given by the Graham's law. Now we move on to the alveolar ventilation, which states that the amount of alveolar ventilation in ml per minute is directly proportional to the rate of carbon dioxide production in ml per minute into the constant. The constant is at 863 millimeters of mercury at body temperature, ambient pressure, and saturated with water vapor. Now, it is also inversely proportional to the alveolar partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the alveolar air, again in millimeters of mercury. Next, we move on to the alveolar gas equation, which states that the partial pressure of oxygen in the alveolar air is directly proportional to the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the inspired air minus the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the alveolar air divided by the respiratory quotient, R. What is this R? The R is the rate of carbon dioxide production, again in milliliters per minute, by the amount of oxygen consumed, again in ml per minute. This gives us an indication of the burning of the food. Now we all know the respiratory quotient for carbohydrates is 1. So this tells us something about the internal combustion. Then we move on to the diffusion coefficients and the diffusion capacities. The diffusion coefficient, as we saw, is dependent on the solubility, is directly proportional to the solubility and inversely proportional to the molecular weight. So based on this, if you compare the different gases, that is oxygen, carbon dioxide, and carbon monoxide, we can see very clearly that the diffusion capacity of carbon dioxide is approximately 20 times more than that of oxygen. That means carbon dioxide can diffuse much faster than your oxygen. Whereas the carbon monoxide and the oxygen are relatively have similar rates of diffusion coefficient or the diffusion capacity, which is nothing but the ml of the gas which can be exchanged per minute for given pressure in millimeters of mercury. Now, if you look at the values, how they change from the atmosphere by the time till they reach the lungs, you will find that there is a progressive fall in the partial pressures of oxygen as the air moves from the air into the lungs, into the blood, and finally into your tissues. Whereas in case of the oxygen, the carbon dioxide, you'll find that there is a progressive decrease in the carbon dioxide as you move from the tissues into the blood, into the lungs, and finally into the air. But so, or look at it the other way. From the entry of air, as it reaches the lungs, the carbon dioxide increases. At the blood, it is at a slightly higher level, whereas it is more in case of the tissues. So you find that the gradient favors the movement of oxygen from the air into the tissues, whereas the gradient favors the movement of carbon dioxide from the tissues to the air simply because of the changes in the partial pressure of carbon dioxide and oxygen. Now, all this exchange occurs across a very specialized membrane, which is called your alveolar or the respiratory membrane. So let us look at the pathway of this. When you look at the pathway of diffusion of gases, air which comes into the alveolus has to first pass through the alveolar epithelium, then it enters into the interstitial space. From there on, it has to cross the epithelial, the basement membrane, then into the capillaries, via the endothelium, reaching into the blood, then crossing the plasma, and it combines with the hemoglobin in the red blood cell. So this is the entire pathway for oxygen, whereas the pathway for diffusion of carbon dioxide is in the reverse direction. Now most of these alveoli, so the first layer which it has to cross from the alveolus towards the RBC is a layer of fluid. This is usually very, very thin and hardly significant. But it becomes a problem when the amount of this fluid increases, say in a case of pneumonia. Then you will find that the diffusion distance increases. So diffusion is hampered in a case of pneumonia. So that is the clinical relevance of this. So if you look at the layers through which the gas has to pass, the first layer is the layer of fluid, which will also include the surfactant to decrease the what you call the surface tension at the level of the alveolus. The alveolar epithelium, its basement membrane, entering into the interstitial space, then entering the basement membrane of the capillaries, crossing the endothelial layer of the capillary membrane, and then into the blood. Now, what are the factors which can determine the transport of gases through the respiratory membrane? We have already seen the Fick's law of diffusion. So we know that it depends on the thickness of the membrane, and it is inversely proportional. So every time the thickness of the membrane increases, as occurs in case of pulmonary edema, in case of pneumonia, in case of fibrosis, we will find that the diffusion distance is increased. So the rate of diffusion will decrease. Now next is the surface area, which is directly proportional. So diffusion is directly proportional to the surface area. So anywhere where there is a decrease in the surface area, like in a pneumonectomy or a lobectomy, which is removal of the entire lung, is pneumonectomy. Lobectomy is removal or surgical excision of a lobe of the lung. Or in case of emphysema, where there is a damage to the architecture of the alveoli. All these can decrease the surface area of the membrane, and hence again diffusion will decrease. The third important thing is the diffusion coefficient of the gas in the substance of the membrane. So if the substance is relatively easily soluble in the membrane, it will be transported faster, like carbon dioxide. Whereas if it is not dissolvable if it's not soluble in the membrane, like carbon monoxide, diffusion will become a problem. And it, of course, most importantly, depends on the gradient of the partial pressures, the difference in the pressures on the two sides of the lung. So greater is the pressure difference, faster is the rate of diffusion. Now, if you look at the uptake of oxygen by the pulmonary capillary blood, so at the arterial end, the pulmonary capillaries are getting in oxygen at a very low level. So there is a tendency of the oxygen to be picked up from the alveolus where the partial pressures are 104. So you find that there's a gradient of 64 millimeters of mercury across the capillary membrane. So oxygen tends to move from the alveolus into the capillaries. So by the time it reaches the venous end, there is an equilibration of the oxygen between the alveolus and the capillaries. So this is how the oxygen is picked up. Now the second important thing that you see is as it is traveling through the capillary, though it remains in the capillary for a good 0.75 seconds, it is during the first one-third itself, that is 0.25 seconds itself, most of the equilibrium has already occurred. So this shows that even if the transit time of the gases and the oxygen and the blood in the capillaries is brought down to one-third, still the exchange will not be hampered. This is what occurs in cases of exercise when the capillary transit time decreases. If you look at the changes in the oxygen as it moves from the systemic venous blood, you'll find that at the tissue level it is around 40. By the time it moves into the pulmonary capillaries, it has picked up the blood, the oxygen, and now the partial pressure of oxygen is increased to 104. But by the time it enters the pulmonary capillaries, but by the time it reaches the left side of the heart, because it is mixed with the pulmonary shunt and there are few veins which directly drain into the left atrium, there is a small fall in the partial pressure of oxygen at the level of the arterial blood. And by the time it reaches the systemic capillaries, the oxygen has been exchanged with the tissues. So again, there's a big fall in the oxygen, partial pressure of oxygen in the capillaries, and the blood entering the systemic venous blood is again at a partial pressure of 40 millimeters of mercury. If you look at the diffusion of oxygen from the tissue capillaries to the cells, so the blood which has been picked up from the lungs is now at a partial pressure of 95 millimeters of mercury. Now, if you look at the tissues, the cells which are most active are at a partial pressure of 23 millimeters mercury because the cells are using up all the oxygen for oxidative phosphorylation for the production of fluid by the burning of the carbohydrates or fats. And in the meantime, the tissues are at 40 millimeters. So there's always a gradient which is there between the capillary and the tissue and between the tissues and the cells, with the gradient favoring the movement of oxygen from the capillaries into the interstitial space into the cells so that the oxygen starved cells can get the oxygen from the capillaries. So by the time it reaches the venous end, all this oxygen has been given up and the partial pressure of the oxygen at the venous end of the capillary is the same again as the tissues, that is at 40 millimeters of mercury. Now if you look at how this oxygen has been given up, we will find that this can be explained by the help of an oxygen dissociation curve. So if you look at the curve, there are three components. The first component, when the change of, so on the x-axis you have the partial pressure of oxygen, and on the y-axis you have the percentage of oxygen saturation with the hemoglobin. So you find that the first 10 millimeters of mercury, there is a linear increase. That means this is almost a straight line. So for the first 10 millimeter rise in the partial pressure of oxygen, the percentage of oxygen saturation of hemoglobin is 10. So this is a linear relationship. After this relation becomes exponential. That means for each percentage rise in partial pressure of oxygen, the rise in the oxygen saturation is much higher. So by the time you have reached 60, you find that the hemoglobin concentration is close to 90. So this is what is called a exponential rise. Now, beyond this, if If you go beyond 90, this more or less becomes a flat line. That means if you increase the partial pressure beyond 60 millimeters of mercury, the amount of oxygen which can be transferred does not really change by much. So what it means that reversely, if the oxygen concentration falls up to 60, there is no problem with picking up of oxygen from the lungs. But if it falls further down below 60, then there's a rapid fall in the saturation of hemoglobin. This is what occurs at high altitudes. So till a good 20,000 feet, you're very safe. But beyond that, the rate of fall of hemoglobin saturation is very rapid. So you have to have supplemental oxygen beyond this. Now, if you look at the factors which can affect the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve, there are four major factors, all of which need to increase. So the first one is an increase in the temperature. Second is the increase in the partial pressure of carbon dioxide. The third is an increase in the 2,3-DPG, which is now called the 2,3-BPG or 2,3-biphosphoglycerate, or an increase in the hydrogen ion concentration, which can also be called, said to be a fall in the pH. So all these factors will decrease the affinity of oxygen for hemoglobin. That means the curve is shifting to the right. Whereas in case the curve will shift to the left, there is a decrease in the P50. That means there is a increase in the affinity. That means it becomes more difficult for it to dissociate. So this is what I've already talked about. A fall in the pH is equivalent to a rise in the hydrogen ion concentration. So what is the Bohr's effect? The Bohr's effect, if you see this curve, which is the normal oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve, this moves to the right because of an increase in the P50. That means, what is the P50? So P50 is where 50% of the hemoglobin is saturated. This is normally at a partial pressure of 27 millimeters of mercury. Now, if the curve shifts to the right, what do you find? The P50 has now more than the 27. Now it is closer to the 40. So this is what you mean by a increased P50, which means there is a decreased affinity. So for the same given partial pressure of oxygen, the dissociation is occurring. It is more difficult for it to dissociate with the hemoglobin. So what is the Bohr's effect? The Bohr's effect is basically effect of carbon dioxide on the oxygen dissociation curve, which means that if there is an increase in the partial pressure of carbon dioxide, the curve shifts to the right. Whereas in case of a fall in the partial pressure of carbon dioxide, the curve shifts to the left. So what is its clinical importance? So in a case where you have hypercarbia, where the carbon dioxide is increased, you find that the dissociation, you will find that the shift of the curve has taken this Tatu stage to a much higher PCO2 level, the PPO2 level. That means initially if the curve was getting flat beyond 60, now it gets flat at around 70. So what does it mean? Which means when there is higher carbon dioxide level, oxygen has to be given to the lungs to counteract this. So now there is a dissociation at 70 rather than starting from 60. So the Bohr's effect is any increase in the carbon dioxide or the hydrogen indirectly, because carbon dioxide will combine with water to form the carbonic acid, which again dissociates into the hydrogen and bicarbonate. So this shifts the oxygen dissociation curve to the right. This is the Bohr's effect. What it does is it enhances the release of oxygen from the blood into the tissues, which I have already shown you. So it enhances the oxygenation of blood in the lungs, and it enhances the release of oxygen from the blood into the tissue as well. Now moving on to the uptake of carbon dioxide by the blood in the tissue capillaries. we find that the partial pressure of carbon dioxide at the tissue level is 40 millimeters, which is same as the partial pressure of oxygen at the venous end. Now, if you look at the cells which are highly metabolic, they will have a partial pressure of 46, whereas the interstitial fluid surrounding the cells is at 45 millimeters mercury. So there is a 1 millimeter mercury gradient which is existing between the cells and the interstitial. But this is good enough for the movement of carbon dioxide from the cell into the tissue fluid or the interstitial fluid and into your capillary. So by the time the blood reaches the venous end of the capillary, it has picked up 5 millimeters mercury worth of carbon dioxide. That means it is now high in carbon dioxide. So this blood has now got to be transported to the lungs to be expired. Now, what are the various forms in which the carbon dioxide is transported? So the carbon dioxide, most of the carbon dioxide which is transported is in combination as a bicarbonate ion. 70% of the carbon dioxide is in the form of bicarbonate. The other 23% combines with hemoglobin as carbonyl compound, carboxyhemoglobin. The third one is as dissolved carbon dioxide. So if you look at the cells which are metabolically active have produced carbon dioxide. This carbon dioxide will diffuse across the membrane, into the endothelium, into the red blood cells. It has to cross the red blood membrane, and in the cells, RBC, it combines with the water in the presence of the carbonic anhydrase to produce the carbonic acid. Now, this carbonic acid is broken down into the hemoglobin, which can into the hydrogen and bicarbonate. The bicarbonate can be transferred into the plasma for transport. This is the major route of transport, and the hydrogen will combine with the hemoglobin to form reduced hemoglobin, and this water can enter the cell freely to be hydrated with the carbon dioxide. And for every bicarbonate which is released by the RBC, it has to be maintained by the inward movement of chloride. Now, this is what occurs, is called the chloride shift. So what happens is every time the carbon dioxide enters the RBC, combines with the water in the presence of carbonic anhydrase to form the carbonic acid, which can break down into the hydrogen and bicarbonate. Now, this bicarbonate, which is negatively charged, every time it leaves the RBC, to maintain the electrical neutrality, you need to have a negative ion coming in. So the chloride, which is the major anion in the PCF, this enters the RBC. This occurs by an anion exchange of 1, or what is called the AE1 protein, or the band 3. This is what is called the chloride exchange. Now, if you look at the fate of carbon dioxide in the blood, in the plasma, we've already seen it can be transported as dissolved form. It can form carbon mono compounds with the plasma proteins. It can be hydrated to form bicarbonate and hydrogen ions. The hydrogen ions can be buffered, and the bicarbonate is the major form of transport in the plasma. Similarly, in the RBC, the carbon dioxide can be transported in the dissolved form, or it can form carbon compounds, or it can be hydrated with water to form the carbonic acid, which is broken down into hydrogen and bicarbonate. Now, this hydrogen is buffered with the hemoglobin, and 70% of the bicarbonate enters the plasma to be transported. Now, every time it enters, the bicarbonate leaves the RBC, chloride moves into the RBC. This is what is called the chloride shift. So this is the fate of carbon dioxide in the blood. Now, once it moves into the cells, all the hydrogen texture, you will find that the osmolarity of the cell has increased because of the movement of chloride into the cells. Now, if you look at the diffusion of carbon dioxide from the pulmonary blood into the alveolus, the blood which has come to the arterial end is high in carbon dioxide, and this has been released again within the first one-third of the time it remains in the capillaries. So the pulmonary capillary blood, which is high in carbon dioxide, releases its carbon dioxide into the alveolar tissues, so that by the time it reaches the alveolar end, it has given up 5 millimeters. The partial pressure of carbon dioxide drops to 40, that is, there's a 5 mm decrease in the partial pressure of the carbon dioxide. Now, like we had an oxygen dissociation curve, we also have a carbon dioxide dissociation curve, which is almost similar but in the reverse direction. So you have the partial pressure of gas in the carbon dioxide on the x-axis, and you have the carbon dioxide in blood, which is expressed as volume percentage. And usually this is kept in the narrow range between 40 to 45. So this is the normal operating range. So as the amount of partial pressure of carbon dioxide increases, you'll find that the carbon dioxide in the blood in volume percentage will also increase. Now let us see how the Haldane effect works. Now just imagine for a moment that you only have the pressure, the partial pressure of oxygen is 100 as occurs in the lungs. Now if you see only this graph, concentrate only on this graph, you'll find that if there is any movement increase in the pCO2, this is the normal curve which follows, whereby the carbon dioxide in the blood increases with increase in the partial pressure of oxygen. Similarly, you also have a second route where the partial pressure of oxygen is low. Now, where do you expect a low partial pressure of oxygen? Yes, this occurs in the tissues. So if you look at the partial pressure of oxygen in the tissues and its effect on the carbon dioxide, you'll find that there can be, when the pressures of carbon dioxide are high, as you can see here at around approximately 52. So if it was only by way of the carbon dioxide in one single graph, so if you move from 52 and you're giving up the oxygen, the carbon dioxide, you'll find that at the venous end you will have a high partial pressure of carbon dioxide, and at the arterial end you have a lower end. So if you look at the graph only at the systemic capillaries, you'll find that if you go from the venous end of the capillary, from the arterial end of the capillary to the venous end of the capillary, you have only picked up, say from 40 you go up, so from 50 you have gone up to 52. That means you have only picked up 2 ml of carbon dioxide from the tissues. Now if at the same time you find that the pCO2 has changed, what would happen? So the pCO2 is now at the level of the lungs. So in case of the level of the lungs, you find that the partial pressure of pCO2 is again minus 40 at the arterial end. So in the lungs, the gradient now, by the time, because there is a change in the partial pressure of oxygen as well, instead of the normal 2 millimeter fall, now it has come from A to B. So what do you find now? If you come forward, same partial pressure of carbon dioxide at the venous end, and by the time it reaches the arterial, at the pulmonary arterial end, by the time it reaches the veins in the lungs, that is, you are talking about the pulmonary capillaries, you'll find that because of a change in the PO2 from 40 to 100, you'll find that the amount of carbon dioxide which is released falls from 52, which is here, to a level of 48. That means you have almost double the amount of carbon dioxide which has been transported from the venous end to the arterial end. So this is what is shown here. So without a change in the PO2, carbon dioxide picked up from the tissues is will go from here to here. Whereas, so it is the amount which is released from blood at the lung would be only 2 ml, which we are looking at this graph here. So without any change in the oxygen, the fall would only be 2 ml, that is from 52 to 50. But in the presence of a change in the partial pressure of oxygen as well, what you will find is the effect is doubled. So it falls from 52 to 42, that is 4 ml. So the deoxygenated, this is because the deoxygenated hemoglobin has greater affinity for carbon dioxide than the oxygenated hemoglobin. So which do you think is more effective, the Bohr's effect or the Haldane effect? I know you would all say Bohr's effect, but it is the Haldane effect, because in case of the Haldane effect, the effect is doubled, whereas in case of the Bohr's effect, it is a small percentage change, maybe 10%, maybe 20%, but it never doubles. So that is the importance of the Haldane effect. Now we move on to the types of diffusion, which is the perfusion limited and the diffusion limited. What do you mean by perfusion limited? For adequate ventilation to be successfully transferred to the tissues, three things have to operate at maximum. So the ventilation has to match the perfusion, which is the amount of blood flowing into the pulmonary capillaries, and this has to be transported. For adequate transport across the membrane, you need good amount of diffusion. So all this ventilation, perfusion, and diffusion must be well balanced. Now, if there's a problem with any one, it will be hampered. Transport of gases will be hampered. So I have already talked about this. The capillary transit time is 0.75, as you can see here. But you see the amount of oxygen under normal conditions. By the time you have crossed only 25 milliseconds in the capillaries, the blood has spent only 0.25 seconds in the capillaries, all the oxygen has been picked up. Similarly, all the carbon dioxide is also given off. But look at the carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide. Even at the time of 0.75, it is still not equilibrating. So this is what will bring us the difference of between the perfusion limited and the diffusion limited. So in case of perfusion limited, the amount of perfusion will determine the exchange of gas, as in case of carbon dioxide and oxygen, and also your nitrous oxide, which is a gas which is used for anesthesia. Now, in these cases, the equilibration between the alveolus and the capillaries occurs within 0.25 seconds. Whereas in case of diffusion limited, at no point that the carbon monoxide actually equilibrates between the two sides. Now, what is the reason for this? The reason for this is the low solubility of the carbon monoxide in the respiratory membrane. So it cannot dissolve in the respiratory membrane to be transported out. So the high solubility, but it has a high solubility in blood where it is combining with the hemoglobin. So what it does is it cannot be transported across the membrane. So carbon monoxide is one of the gases which is diffusion limited. That means the exchange will be limited by diffusion. Whereas in case of perfusion limited gases, the amount of exchange will be limited by the amount of perfusion, which means more is the perfusion, more is the exchange. Whereas in diffusion limited, more is the diffusion, more is the exchange. Now, diffusion limited capacity will be decreased in conditions like emphysema, pulmonary fibrosis, as well as the adult respiratory distress syndrome, what is called the ARDS. Then we move on to hypoxia, which is of different types. We will deal with them in greater detail in later stages, but we need to remember there are 4 types: the hypoxic type, the stagnant or the circulatory type, where there is a hypoperfusion. Then is the anemic type, and lastly you have the histotoxic type. The hypoxic hypoxia occurs at high altitudes In cases of sleep apnea, what is also can be called the obstructive sleep apnea, in case of nitrous oxide poisoning, or in case of pulmonary diseases where there is a fall in the oxygen or there is a fall in the ventilation perfusion ratio. Hypoxic hypoxia is also seen in cases of chronic obstructive pulmonary diseases like emphysema and asthma. It is also called COPD. It can also occur in fibrosis or any neuromuscular disorders. Stagnant type or circulatory type of failure you have already seen in case of heart failure, where you can have hypoxia because of stagnation of the blood, because of the inability of the heart to pump. It can occur in cardiac arrest, where the mechanism is similar. In case of stroke, where your vasomotor central regulation is hampered. In case of vascular disease, because of an obstruction, you can have a stagnation, or because of AV shunts. Anemic hypoxia occurs in carbon monoxide poisoning and, of course, anemia, as the term denotes. Histotoxic hypoxia occurs because of cyanide poisoning, where it disrupts the cytochrome oxidase, so, or in case of sodium azide poisoning. So these are the two conditions where you have histotoxic hypoxia. This is because of damage to the enzymes which are responsible. So in hypoxia, you have the different types. So in hypoxic hypoxia, the PO2 is low, and this is the only condition where supplementary oxygen is beneficial. If you look at the PCO2 and the concentration of oxygen, you'll find that they are normal in case of circulatory failure. It's only that the amount of oxygen which is being delivered to the tissue is low because of a circulatory failure. In case of anemic hypoxia, the partial pressure of oxygen is okay, but again the problem is with low amount of oxygen delivered to the tissues. And in histotoxic hypoxia, you find that the PO2 is okay, the concentration of oxygen is okay, amount delivered is okay, but the utilization is a problem. So there's a low utilization because of damage to the enzymes responsible for its usage. So next we move on to the carbon monoxide poisoning. If you look at the differences between the oxygen dissociation curve and the carbon monoxide hemoglobin dissociation curve, you find that carbon monoxide has very high affinity for hemoglobin. That means that even for a small rise in the partial pressure of carbon monoxide, almost 100% saturation occurs even at very, very low concentrations of PCO2. That means it binds very strongly with the hemoglobin. So what it does to the oxygen dissociation curve is, so this is your normal oxygen dissociation curve at a hemoglobin concentration of 14 grams per liter, which is the normal concentration. Now, if there is a fall in the oxygen dissociation, the amount of hemoglobin to 50%, this is what occurs. So you have the oxygen dissociation curve at 15 mm. So you have the concentration of oxygen is decreased. But if you have a simultaneous addition of carboxyhemoglobin, then you find that the curve shifts to the left and dissociation becomes very, very difficult. So it is more dangerous for carbon monoxide to combine with hemoglobin than can be explained by only a fall in the hemoglobin. Because here there's no problem with the release to the tissue. But in this case, release will only occur once the partial pressure falls to 40. But by that time, the tissue is already hypoxic. So in case of carbon monoxide, you find that the alveoli, very small amounts of 0.4 millimeters are adequate to cause, but these are only 1 out of 250 times that of oxygen. But this is enough to be completely combined with hemoglobin. That means it will compete with the oxygen to combine with the hemoglobin. So there is no hemoglobin left for it to combine with the oxygen, because most of it, because of the high affinity of carbon monoxide for hemoglobin, it combines first with the carbon monoxide, leaving very little hemoglobin behind. So it combines with hemoglobin at same point as does oxygen. So it can displace oxygen from hemoglobin, hence decreasing the oxygen carrying capacity of the blood. So hemoglobin combined with hemoglobin of 50% in an anemic patient can perform moderate work, as I've explained, because delivery is still intact. But in case of carbon monoxide poisoning, because of the carbon monoxide combining with the hemoglobin, work capacity is seriously hampered. And I've told you the reason for this. This is because it binds with hemoglobin, carbon monoxide binds with hemoglobin 250 times faster, times as much stronger with oxygen. So the dissociation curve is shift to the left, so it prevents the unloading of oxygen and decreases the amount of oxygen delivered to the tissues. So in case of carbon monoxide poisoning, it depends on the duration of exposure, it depends on the concentration of carbon monoxide in the inspired air, and it also depends on the alveolar ventilation. The arterial PO2 is normal. The chemoreceptors are not stimulated because there is no problem with the PO2. Skin, nail beds, and mucosa appear cherry red, and there is no cyanosis. Symptoms will include headache and nausea. Chronic exposures to sublethal levels can cause progressive brain damage. It can bring about mental changes and Parkinson-like symptoms, which includes tremor, rigidity, and akinesia. Lethal concentrations occur at 60 to 7 when 60 to 70% is hemoglobin is converted into carbon monoxide hemoglobin, and the treatment is 100% of oxygen at 5% and 5% of carbon dioxide. Now, the reason for giving this 5% carbon dioxide is carbon dioxide is a very potent stimulant for respiration. So, there's a natural way of increasing your respiratory rates. Now, this 100% oxygen will ensure that the amount of, even though the hemoglobin is not free, the amount of combined the oxygen dissolved in the blood will increase. So this is one way you can increase the delivery of oxygen to the tissues. So in summary, gas exchange and transport will follow all physical laws. Gas exchange requires adequate ventilation, perfusion, and normally functioning alveolo-capillary membrane. Carbon dioxide affects transport of oxygen and vice versa. The effect of oxygen on carbon dioxide transport is explained by the Haldane effect. The effect of carbon dioxide on the oxygen transport or exchange is explained by the Bohr's effect. Normal exchange is perfusion limited. Diseases, in case of diseases like COPD, fibrosis, it becomes diffusion limited, and alterations in exchange or transport can cause hypoxia. There are four types of hypoxia: hypoxic hypoxia, circulatory hypoxia, stagnant hypoxia, anemic hypoxia, and histotoxic hypoxia. And vehicular pollution can lead to increase in carbon monoxide poisoning, and this is a serious health hazard. So these are my references. Thank you so much.